Hi, everyone. This is Scott Young here, and I'm here with a group of presenters to talk about what happens when data endangers, tools and strategies for risk assessment, policy analysis, and advocacy. This presentation is part of Endangered Data Week 2020. The presenters today are members of the DLF PET working group. That includes Kristin, Briney, Scarlet, Galvan, Michelle Gibault, Paige Walker, and me, Scott Young. You may be wondering what DLF PET is. Well, DLF PET is the Digital Library Federation Privacy and Ethics in Technology Working Group. And so you can learn more about the work that we do at this URL. More about us. Here's our job titles and where we come from. So we have lots of different perspectives on this topic, and our group does really good work. So part of this session is to help promote and share the resources that our group has produced, and then also to invite people into the work of the group. So if you're learning about us for the first time, check us out. I'm the co-convener of the working group, and Michelle is the other co-convener. And so we're here to let you know that this group exists, these resources exist, and they can help practitioners respond to data collection technologies when data endangers. So I want to just talk a little bit about the history of the group. It was motivated by the recognition that libraries are increasingly investing in systems that collect, store, analyze, and it must be said, potentially leak data related to user activities. So our group focuses on challenging our relationships with data collection technologies, not just accepting them unquestioningly. So we critically engage, and then we try to develop guidelines and tools and resources to help us, well, as it says here, we seek to create tools and resources to help practitioners critically engage with data collection technologies. We're trying to align our practice with privacy-oriented principles, so that's where the ethics come from. And ultimately, we're working for the betterment of our profession, our user communities, and then thinking really big picture, society. So here are some of the tools and resources that we've produced. The first three listed here, our presenters today will discuss briefly: a practical guide to performing a library user data risk assessment in library-built systems, vendor privacy policy analysis, an advocacy action plan for helping to advance the goals of these resources. And then we have a couple others we're not covering today, but they're great. The digital privacy instruction curriculum for instructors to help teach these topics. And then kind of like a getting started guide, ethics in research use of library patron data, glossary and explainer. That's an amazing resource. Okay, so our first co-presenter today is Kristin Briney.
Thank you, Scott. So I'm here today to talk about a practical guide to performing a library user data risk assessment in library-built systems, which is a very long title. Basically, it means for all the data that a library holds, how do you think about the risk in holding it, and how do you minimize and mitigate that risk? As I said, I'm Kristin Briney, she, hers, hers, and I'm the biology librarian at Caltech. And I want to recognize my co-authors who wrote this document with me: Becky Yost, John Mark Ackerbloom, and Shay Swager, without whom this document would not finally be out in the world. So to take a step back and explain how to use this document, I want to talk a little bit about how I view privacy, because I think of it in really two modalities. I view it kind of in the theoretical and the ethical and the policy side, and things we argue about a lot, and what should we do about privacy. And then I view it in the very practical side, being that we have a lot of data about people, and how do we practically protect it in order to protect people's privacy. And this document definitely falls into the latter modality, specifically talking about the data that we as libraries hold, not the data that our vendors hold. And that will be somebody else on this call, this video, talking about that. So this document, I want to run through it briefly to explain how to use it. And it comes in 4 sections. So the first section talks a little bit about the types of data that create risk to hold. And nominally, this is personally identifiable information, or PII, so data about people. And the document recognizes that not all the data about people, not all PII has the same level of risk. So direct information about people, your name, your driver's license number, your email address, that primary identifier is high risk. When we collect that information, if that gets out, it can be very damaging. But there's some medium risk stuff like demographics or behaviors. You come into the library every day at 4 p.m. That can be more or less identifying. So me saying I'm a white woman in librarianship is not really identifying that particular demographic combination, but a Black female physics major at my institution, for example, would be very identifying. So there's varying levels of risk here. And we want to recognize that the risk in holding something like aggregate gate counts is fairly low. So we might handle different data differently. Section 2 goes further into thinking about risk by talking about the different types of threats to data. And this is everything from what you might think of the data breach or improper or external access to data, all the way up to data corruption and uncontrolled data spread. So you have data in one system and it spreads to others, and it goes from a secure system to a less secure system. And for all of these different threat types, each comes with a probability, level of harm, and a mitigation strategy. And this is really important to contextualize each threat and to give you some foundation for deciding which threat to address and mitigate first. So the example of the data breach versus improper internal access, they have about the same level of harm, but the data breach is actually probably less likely than improper internal access. So using those two metrics can really help guide you for what mitigations need to happen first. So section 3 actually goes through all of the mitigation strategies that we recommend that correspond to threat types in section 2. And these are things that are traditionally considered to be data management or data security, everything from minimizing data collection, getting informed consent, and destroying data when no longer needed. Then section 4 wraps everything up and gives you some ways to actually put this risk assessment framework into action. And what we recommend is actually doing a data inventory. So there are a number of library systems listed in section 4 for you to inventory, and there's a set of questions that you can use to interrogate those systems to understand what types of data, what types of patron data, what types of PII are in those systems, and how that data is managed. Then you can use that data inventory, identify particular risks, use the probability and the harm level to target particular threats to mitigate, and use those mitigation strategies in order to improve the protections and privacy around those particular pieces of data. So all in all, it's one framework for thinking through data protection. It can seem overwhelming with how much patron data we have, how much data about people any institution has. And we hope we find this risk assessment framework to be useful and one strategy for really sifting through all this and figuring out ways to target data protection around the highest risk information that we hold. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Kristin. That was great. What a great resource. Next up, we have Scarlet Galvan to talk about vendor privacy policy analysis.
Thanks, Scott, and thank you, Kristin, for your group's work. I think that the privacy policy analysis project is probably best used in conjunction with the risk assessment to data. If we're looking at how we might use all of these tools together, that's definitely one compatible opportunity that I saw there. I'm Scarlet Galvan. I'm the collection strategist librarian at Grand Valley State University Libraries, at least when I can talk. My pronouns are she, her. I authored this particular project with Margaret Heller and a variety of other folks who participated in the policy analysis. So to kind of provide a little bit of background, and first I want to say for a variety of reasons, everyone who participated in this has kind of moved on from this particular work because of third-party platform policies and how those policies are implemented move very quickly, and they're when it works well, respond very quickly to these kinds of things. So what we wanted to do was to offer starting points into understanding how patron data interacts with your particular library, some questions to ask, and also focus on the work of others, because so much analysis of vendor policies and how they play out and how libraries respond to privacy is happening in different spaces. So we'll get to that in a second as well. This report came out of discussions in 2018 that followed, or the group was formed in 2018 that followed the implementation of the General Data Privacy Regulation, or GDPR. Even though this only affected initially US institutions with facilities in Europe, since it's an EU regulation, it meant that nearly all vendors had to update their practices and policies. So even if those policies were not enforceable in the United States per se, they required disclosures and in some cases gave more detailed information about the company's privacy practices or their view of privacy, or created new mechanisms to protect or remove data. Because if you can remove it for someone in the EU as a user, you can remove it for someone in the United States, even if the law isn't applicable. The workflow and the sort of extraction techniques exist to do that. We all might remember the flood of emails about revised privacy practices for GDPR compliance, which seem to come from everyone. So for our purposes in the working group, we're considering endangered data in the context of, again, like Scott said, how data is used and what it's used for. So the report itself offers an overview of themes found between 8 different privacy policies from vendors, including library services platforms and integrated library systems, aggregators, content providers, databases. Thematically, they all make claims about privacy in light of GDPR, but how that plays out is never in the policy. As someone who spends a lot of time negotiating licenses, when I'm asked for specific clauses to be put into license agreements, they will respond with, "We have a privacy policy, here it is." So this does play out in terms of how our resources are accessed and what information is gathered about us. One important distinction that we want to make is that all of these policies include pretty wide latitude for sharing data with third-party contractors or to comply with legal or government information requests. So how exactly that functions for each vendor is going to be a little bit different, but there was almost exclusively an emphasis on, we'll just hand this over if we receive a subpoena or to comply with other legal frameworks. So access to electronic resources has never been anonymous. And there's been work highlighting this problem in library and information science literature for some time, and understanding this is part of how we're going to get at this problem. The report goes further into authentication, for example, and why we need to understand our systems better if we don't already have ownership of them. Oftentimes, proxy servers and identity management are responsibilities that are housed outside the library. So this might involve many different people on campus in terms of, we didn't consider that someone would do this with that data. Well, that's why the library needs to come in and say, yes, they will. Awareness of third-party enhancements and moves toward personalization is often held by library workers that are least likely to be part of administrative and sort of value and mission-driven conversations. So library administrators should holistically understand the implications of a license agreement in the context of their organization's value statements. And workers with deep workflow and process knowledge must be part of agenda setting and advocacy efforts early on in order to protect patron privacy, and working together to understand the library's values and put those into policy will help. But some of these decisions are really hard to make, since many resources that we license, especially in academic libraries, require personally identifying information as a condition of access for subscriptions. And that includes things like Washington Post, New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Visual History Archive, Wharton Research Data Services, O'Reilly Safari Books, whatever it's calling itself now, Reaxis and Canopy, and many others. And so understanding how to explain this requirement and function within it is work that can't be done by one department. Like, there's so many poor e-resources librarians running around trying to explain, no, it matters that we give PII over and we need to stop it. So our intent wasn't, again, to build a toolkit, but to offer some mid-level analysis and point to the work of others looking into these questions. How do we responsibly use patron data, and how might we increase capacity around understanding the implications of vendor-built systems? So the resource offers several starting points for discussion. I'll highlight a couple of them. One is that Policy is not a guarantee. What are you actually sharing with people? And this goes for accessibility claims too. Are you compliant or not? Understanding flow of information during the authentication process. When we authenticate, we have a lot of options for how it's configured. So we can say authentication should be yes, you have access, or no, you have access, not yes, you have access and you're a faculty member and you looked at this journal and you ran those 4 searches. Some of those are appropriate to know, some of those aren't. We should plan responses to government requests for patron information now. I really think that's something that should happen now if it's not already a conversation that's happening in our libraries. Work is iterative. Policies and how they apply change. For example, we've included in an appendix just a few policy issues and data breaches as starting points for understanding how this plays out in libraries. One of them, for example, involves EBSCO's initial configuration of Google Drive with EBSCO databases. A number of libraries submitted tickets about this, and the permissions required to get that integration going for users have been dialed back to be much more appropriate for that app. But pushback only works if we know about it. And in particular, I want to highlight Cornell's Privacy as a Service page that's part of our report. They have excellent work. They're using an instance of Archiveit to capture and document changes in vendor privacy policies. Really excellent work done there. And Syracuse Libraries, licensing principles, just outstanding work there. And I want to wrap this up by saying that an area where a lot more widespread attention is needed, building on the work of investigations like data doubles and similar, and the libraries, I mean, academic libraries' occasional misplaced eagerness to engage in institutional learning analytics, and that's to use those requests to push back, like librarians at Wake Forest University did, who issued a statement refusing to adopt or promote problematic online proctoring services. The library is not a place that will ever be 100% safe, but we can definitely work to make sure that our institutions and practices are. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Scarlet. Vendor privacy policy is so complicated, and just really grateful for this work that demystifies some of this and gives us the tools for engaging with vendors who often have so much more information, so much different information. So this is great. And I really liked hearing about the sort of participatory aspects of this, getting more people involved in the process. So that was great. Thank you. And next we have Michelle and Paige Walker for Advocacy Action Plan.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for attending. My plan is to go over a little bit of the advocacy group and what we were trying to accomplish, and to give you a sense of what this piece of document is intended to do. And then Paige is going to sort of talk about how it might be applicable during COVID for doing advocacy that we haven't really even expected to be doing. So with that, I'll just begin with a few things that Scarlet touched on. The first was that advocacy work is iterative. So there's not going to ever be a single moment when this is applicable. There's going to be many moments when this is really hopefully useful to you. The second thing that she said that really made a lot of sense to me was that a holistic understanding of library administrators and then university administrators, if those exist, is also extremely important. When we were doing this report, we were conscious of the fact that it was a bunch of academic librarians, and I'll read the list of co-authors really quickly who aren't presenting with me. Eliza Bettinger at Cornell was extremely helpful. Mariah Burnett, and then Yasmin Shora, she's one of the founding members of PET. All of these people came together and helped us work on this plan, which doesn't include any public librarians. So meanwhile, at the time, I was doing work for my community in Arkansas, and I was able to talk with some public librarians about sort of how they thought about privacy. And so we tried to include not just sort of university administrators, but sort of the idea also that you might be working with city council members, mayors, people who don't really understand the details of why librarians care so much about privacy, so that it makes sense to why you're so passionate about it. In the context of when data endangers, it's always really important to think about how you are perceived when you're talking about danger. We understand that there's inherent dangers in the way that data can be used against someone, but that isn't the way most people come across. Sort of notions of big data are supposed to help us infinitely, and the reason we will always want to collect all data is because we can't anticipate the possible uses in the future, and so why would we hinder ourselves? The opposite case is also true, though. So making the case for why it might be necessary to not always collect data is something that librarians have been doing for a very long time. And part of the detriment that we're currently witnessing when it comes to, sort of broader social issues around data being shared and micro-targeting have to do with the fact that librarians haven't really been listened to very much as to why we preserve and sometimes ditch data when it's no longer necessary to keep. So with that being said, I'll just talk briefly about how this is sort of contextualized and what this is used for, and then we'll move on to how you might use this right now. So the two things that I want to really focus on that you can understand that this report gets at is sort of why privacy is important to librarians. These sort of words about intellectual freedom point to the idea of, sort of individual rights and freedoms. This can be kind of a dead end, though, if you don't make sure that you understand the value to the collective of privacy and to the community as a whole. This is really what I would suggest you want to focus on if you're doing any advocacy work with administrators or people who are empowered to make decisions. The second thing is sort of this idea that libraries exist within larger organizations, and that there will be data collection going on that you might not agree with, is pretty much going to be the case if you are functioning within a larger organization. And so the sooner you understand that, the better. So what do I use this, this report for mostly? Mostly I hear academic libraries are trying to use Google Analytics. Perhaps it's been enforced from above that they need to use Google Analytics. They have no choice in the matter. There are options for making Google Analytics a little bit more privacy focused, and Scott Young, who is our moderator today, led work on responsible web analytics for library websites, and that link is included within this report. And oftentimes, if I'm talking to somebody and they want to hear about that, I'm able to just grab this action plan and send the whole PDF to them, because it not only includes that link, but many other links to many other resources that can help somebody feel more broadly empowered. So with that, I'll hand it over to Paige.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle, and thanks everyone for listening today. As Michelle hinted, this advocacy action plan has become increasingly relevant this year in 2020, as we've been faced with just a ton of data collection during the COVID-19 pandemic. As contact tracing apps spring up around our communities, libraries may be asked, for instance, to leverage our status as gathering spaces and track the identities and movements of patrons who enter our doors. Although it might be difficult to completely avoid the contact tracing during this public health crisis, we invite you to reference our guide in order to better advocate for the privacy of patrons as we navigate through these new sets of institutional regulations together. The Advocacy Action Plan also specifically addresses the risks of collecting biometric data using programs such as fingerprint and facial recognition software. Unlike passwords, biometric data cannot be changed if it's collected, stolen, or otherwise misused. Furthermore, it's been pretty well established that the algorithms that underlie these technologies disproportionately misidentify or misclassify folks from marginalized groups. In this plan, we specifically cite the 2019 amendment to ALA's privacy interpretation of the Library Bill of Rights, which states that these technologies are inconsistent with the mission of facilitating access to library resources free from any unreasonable intrusion or surveillance. You may also use this plan to advocate against facial recognition, not only at your library, but also in your community. I'd like to highlight here the work that the Boston Public Library Professional Staff Association did in their testimony to support the banning of government use of facial recognition technology in the city of Boston, which City Council actually voted to ban in June of 2020. So we hope this guide will inform similar endeavors to advocate for the privacy of our library patrons, as well as our community members at large. Thanks so much for listening.
Thanks, Paige and Michelle. Okay, that takes us to the end. We just want to say thank you for watching. If you have made it to the end here, thank you. If you just skipped ahead to the end and you're on this slide, thank you too. That's pretty clever. Here is the URL. Again, you can find all of these resources. As Scarlet mentioned, they interact, they interrelate, and together they present a really strong way forward to help enhance privacy and ethics in the technologies that we use in libraries. So also want to take this opportunity to say some acknowledgements. Thank you to Shay Swager and Yasmin Shorish for starting this group in 2017. And thanks to Brandon Locke and the other Endangered Data Week organizers for creating the space for us to talk about these resources. So with that, I'll say thanks to the co-presenters and thank you again for watching. Bye.